Okay, well, it's 6:30. Can I welcome everyone to the my final meeting? But one hopes that I can hand over to a successor who will carry on the work that we as a committee have established over the last few years. I really hope so. Let's begin with a apologies for absence.
Councillor Gregory has given her apologies, Chair.
Councillor Gregory. Anyone else? Okay. Item 2, declarations of interest. Do I have any? Yeah.
Actually, Chair, I think I saw an email. Apologies from.
Actually, could you? Oh, sorry. I'm on.
There was apologies from Councillor Robert Chapman, Cabinet Member for Finance.
And next item is the non-confidential minutes of the previous meeting, and unless anyone's got any points of difference over the contents, we can go to matters arising. I'm not hearing anybody unhappy about those. Number of updates, though, still awaited. So could we just get an update on those? Particularly the first one, James Goddard, an update is awaited on the issue of fire safety and net zero. I think that was one I think you raised, Councillor Smythe. Do we know who has responsibility for this? I'm just unhappy about some 3 months ago not having heard anything about it. It seems to me unsatisfactory. So I'm looking for someone to take.
I'm happy to follow up with them.
Will you take that away, please, Ian? Yeah, and just it really isn't acceptable to not. There may be reasons not to be able to reply. What there isn't any reason for is not to tell us what those reasons are. So I think that's something that must be conveyed. The training session we've just had, I do think it was a good principle. Sadly, not that many people attended, but I would hope that the training session can now be used as the basis for a training session for new members who join the committee under the new administration. So I don't think in any way that that material will be wasted, and I would suggest that there is an early training on the whole issue of risk. It's at the heart of a lot of what we do, and it needs people to understand it. So I'd commend that being run in the early part of the new administration. Hardship Fund under 4.7. Ian, under your name?
Yeah. Great stuff. I'll cover it under our finance update.
Sorry,
I'll cover it under the finance update.
Okay, thanks. Sickness. Now this, I mean, we can come back to sickness because I really want to explore that, because we're seeing total still going up, and the issue is how much this is due to COVID and how much to longer term issues or other categories. And again, will that be covered in the update?
We can cover that under the performance.
Yeah, because I do think very important, particularly with this new wave of COVID coming in, to find out how much the continual rising numbers are to do with that. That'd be good. Then recycling, Bruce, you've recycled, thanks for that. Treasury, yeah, we've arranged a training session again on Treasury management. HRA, we are awaiting a response. I wasn't quite sure what that related to, Peter, where it says awaiting a response.
I've chased up those 4 points and I haven't had a response back yet.
Ah, right. Okay. Well, again, can this be taken up? That was something we had a very good report at the last meeting on the HRA. Sorry? Do I have a Deirdre? Yes.
Yeah, I think we circulated a presentation of those indicators that you wanted to look at regularly. That's been circulated, but there were 4 points that Steve thought he'd actually responded to in the meeting. He's due to join us at 6:45 for an update on that. But if you want a verbal update, a written update, I'll get him to do that. There were 4 points around the use of algorithms, something about the energy crisis or something. There were 4 points that he's going to respond to when he attends. But if you want him to, he can circulate a written response to you on those 4 points.
Great, yes, I welcome that, because he made some, I thought, very helpful commitments in answer to Councillor Rathbone's points that we would have a regular update. This is such a big and key issue for members that I think they really deserve a very regular update on these issues, particularly around repairs and arrears.
Yeah.
Okay, if you could follow that up, Deirdre, and make sure that comes to us, I'd be grateful.
There is a presentation within the actions table, though, which covers the latest position on repairs and the latest
on all these issues.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's just those 4 additional points that aren't covered that Steve was going to cover here today. But I'll ask him to send a written response on those 4 issues.
Very good, thank you. And then there we go. Yeah, the key issue of the annual accounts, which is in the supplementary papers. And am I looking to Ian to take us through the introduction, or Jackie? I'm not sure.
Thanks for that, Chair. I'll just very quickly introduce the item, and then Jackie will take us through it in a bit more detail. But firstly, what I'd like to do is place on record my thanks to the team in Hackney and our external auditors as well, who've got us to this point. It's been really challenging, as you all know, but really glad we're here tonight. And so Jackie will just take us through some of the detail, and then we'll hand over to Suresh.
Right, okay, thank you. So what this report does this evening is presents the final accounts for 2021. As you're aware, this is quite considerably later than they would normally be presented, and that's due to the specific challenges we had in relation to the cyber attack and the impact that had on some of our main financial system, mainly the academy system, the system which supports the HRA and also the Mosaic system. So we're asking for the Audit Committee to approve the Statement of Accounts tonight, and also approve that the Group Director of Finance and Corporate Resources be authorised to agree and approve the final statements, recognising that there may be some small change in amendments once the auditors have finalised their work. And we're also asking that you consider and approve in its own right the annual governance statement contained within the Statement of Accounts. So I don't sort of propose to go through this report in detail, but I'm just going to point out a few key points for you. So on page 8, we refer to the movement in reserve statement, and what's key here is that we've seen an increase in general reserves between 1920 and 2021 by 22 million. But just to point out, that mainly relates to the fact that we received grant in respect of the additional release which ratepayers were given, and that was held in reserve. So effectively that was deployed the following year. So it wasn't actually a real increase in our resources. It was set aside to meet a deficit that accrued as a result of the additional reliefs that were provided. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is in relation to the collection fund, and the fact that we've got a rather large deficit on the collection fund, which is recorded here. And again, that's primarily related to the fact that we was budgeted based on a certain number of bills being raised, and then the government announced additional release for retail, hospitality and leisure after the budget was set, and so that deficit occurred in the collection fund, and the council was funded for that, to recover that for the following year, plus some compensation for the other element of the deficit. The pension fund accounts at section 12. So the pension fund accounts were considered by the Pensions Committee in November, but it is this committee's role to approve those accounts as part of the overall audit Committee's approval of the council's main financial statements. It's also worth pointing out that the fund, the net assets of the fund increased quite significantly between 1920 and 2021 by 370 million. But it's also worth mentioning that 370 billion rather, no, million. But it's also worth mentioning that when we, at the end of 1920, we saw the first impacts of the pandemic. So there's probably an artificial low point then, which then increased as we come towards the end of 2021. Under the annual governance statement, we set out in here what our responsibilities are, and as at section 13.8, we note that the 6 areas of actions which needed to be addressed at the end of 2021, and not surprisingly, they relate to the corporate impact of the cyber attack. We reflect on the fact that the statement of accounts were delayed as a result of the cyber attack. We were aware of the cost pressures in children's and families and education, as well as the impact of the Ofsted judgment. And again, in adult social care, the issues raised were in relation to cost pressures, business continuity plans, and housing with care. Not surprisingly, public health and the impact of COVID-19 was highlighted, as well as the ongoing impact of the cyber attack on housing management systems. So that's really the main points from the accounts. I don't know if you want to carry straight on to the audit, or if anyone's got any questions in relation to the accounts. I don't know if anyone's got any questions in relation to the statement of accounts, or if you want us to carry straight on to the audit report.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the next item on the agenda is a recovery report in respect of the Mazars audit of our accounts for 2021 in relation to both the main statements and also the pension fund. So attached to the report is an audit update report in relation to the main statements, and an initial audit completion report in relation to the pension fund statements. At the moment, there's no significant issues which have been highlighted which might impact on our opinion and result in a modified opinion. But it's worth highlighting that there's a national issue which is causing some delay in relation to the sign-off of accounts. So effectively all firms are not signing off any more accounts now. It's in relation to an issue on infrastructure assets, which I'm sure our auditors will go through in a bit more detail. So at that point, hand over to Suresh.
Yeah. Thanks, Jackie, and good evening to committee members. Let me give you an overview of the 2 reports that you've got in front of you. And then Stuart will just give you an update on the status of both of those audits. As Jackie alluded to, and as you'll see in the reports, both audits remain in progress, but subject to receiving some final items of information, we do anticipate completing our audit testing by early May, and then completing our review procedures soon after. As Jackie alluded to, we and the council referred to a national issue that has arisen that is preventing not just Mazars but all audit firms from concluding any local government audits at the moment. It's largely out of our direct control, although we are party to SIPFA's Task and Finish group, which is looking at this issue and seeking to find some resolution, but that is not expected, as far as we understand, until early June. So my overall message at the moment is that, subject to the resolution of that national issue, and obviously subject to the completion of some of the outstanding audit work, I do still expect to issue an unqualified opinion on both the council and pension fund accounts, and I've not identified any significant weakness in value for money arrangements. So when we report our completed audit, you will see that we have no matters in relation to value for money of concern. I do appreciate that it's a little bit disappointing and frustrating that we're not in a position to conclude the audit today. But when I've reflected on the fact that we started both audits in January, we started from scratch, so we didn't have our usual kind of interim process in terms of the systems work that we normally carry out. And also, reflecting on some of the challenges that were presented by the impact of the cyber attack. Through the actually really good cooperation that we've had between both teams, I think the audit has generally progressed well. And whilst we're a little bit behind where we would ideally want, we're still not in a better position overall. There's also just a reflection on, if you look back at the audit strategy memo that we presented back in January, I think at the time we were probably both unsure of the extent that the cyber attack might have had on the ability of the council to provide all the relevant evidence to support the accounts. But I must say, thanks to the efforts of the finance team, and particularly Ms, Antonio and Jackie, whilst some of the evidence might have taken a little bit longer, then we would ideally want to be provided. We've had no instances where the council has been unable to support any item of accounts with sufficient evidence, and I think that's a real positive in light of the significant impact that the cyber attack did have. So let me hand over to Stuart now, and he'll just give you a quick update on the status of both the audits, and then we'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Suresh. I'm just going to run through pages 209 and 233 in the pack very briefly, just to give you an update on where we are on the progress. Starting with 209, the testing complete but subject to review. This is actually only 4 items because the housing revenue account is in twice. That has been reviewed now, as have the long-term liabilities. The journals has been reviewed but not finished, as there was an outstanding point that I know has been resolved. Pensions, that's as reviewed as it can be, but obviously there is a direct relationship between the council's work and the pension fund work. So that won't be finalised until the pension fund audit is completed. In terms of the testing in progress, there were a number of areas here, as you can see, that were incomplete. Those that have now moved to completion and are being reviewed would be the movement in reserve statement, much of payroll work. The work on valuations is very close to being finished. I know investment property has 1 item that we're tidying up with. Work on debtors provisions is now complete, just needs to be written up. Cash and bank has been finalised, as has work on reserves and collection funds. So we've made a lot of progress since we issued the report, I think just over a week ago, in terms of our actual getting to the point of being, as Suresh says, to be able to sign off. I cannot stress that although that still leaves a number of points outstanding, particularly around income and expenditure and the like, we're waiting on 2 or 3 items in individual areas just to be able to complete our work. So it's not a whole test is outstanding, it's just a couple of things of data and information to be provided. Moving to page 233 on the pension fund, similar position really to report. In terms of the complete, which obviously has a longer list at that point, related parties, fund account, the admin and other expenses, the fund account, return on investments are all now been reviewed. Investment assets largely reviewed, but being such a significant area, a couple of points to follow up on, so don't want to clear that one just yet. Testing in progress, journals has moved significantly, as has cash and bank. We're just waiting for a final couple of pieces of information. So again, it looks, there's a lot to do. It's nearly at the point of completion, and we would hope by early May, we're targeting 6th of May, we're at a point where just about everything we can do is done, and we're waiting for the infrastructure update that Suresh talked about earlier in terms of being able to conclude and sign off on our audits.
Thanks for those 2 reports. Can I draw the conclusion, Suresh and Stuart, from what you've said, that you feel that the accounts that have been presented to us for approval are as near you giving a tick to them as it's feasible to be without actually giving that tick?
I think, Chair, the only thing that would prevent me from saying that with 100% certainty is the infrastructure assets issue, because we still don't know which way that's going to land in terms of the resolution of that. But aside from that, all other aspects of the accounts, as Jackie alluded to, we haven't identified anything of significance that requires an amendment to the account. So yes, in terms of the accounts that sit in front of you this evening, we're saying that we're relatively satisfied with the figures the way they stand at the moment.
Well, that's helpful, because I need to recommend to members that they do approve these, and clearly the opinion that you have on them is a very material one. But I'm taking from your statements that we can safely approve these accounts, and I hope I'm correct in that assessment of what you've both said. Okay, Jackie, do you want to say anything, or Ian, anything else on the accounts before I ask members for any questions? No, you're okay. Members, any questions about the statement? Yeah, Councillor Smythe.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm just looking at the Mazars document, Chair, page 212. Just reading the sort of the management override of controls and how they sort of address this risk essentially. But they added that their work is still in progress. I just wanted to know what areas they are still kind of working on, because they put down 3 ways that they're addressing the issue. Are they addressing all 3 of them currently now? Have they done some of them? And you know, which other ones are they going to look at in the time being?
Great,
I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense.
You're
So
jumping
actually,
on.
I'll pick up on that one quite happily. The primary area where we're still working around would be items 1 and 3. The estimates, purely because there are a number of increased estimates as we identified in this strategy memorandum, we just need to make sure we've documented that completely in terms of the impact of cyber attack. We have information, particularly around debtors provisions and the like, which just needs to be finalised. And our testing of journals, as I mentioned, there's a couple of items we've just followed up to get some more detail. Until that's, if you like, in our hands, not necessarily physically, but effectively electronically, then it's difficult to, as auditors, we won't conclude until we've actually seen it, if you like.
Could I just come back on that just very briefly, please? So you've estimated the date for 20th of April. Do you think you'll reach that completion date?
I think that was an update to the committee. I think our aim is still by 6th of May, as I said, to be able to.
Oh, that's today, yeah, of course, yeah. Sorry.
At a point where we're concluded on those, as all of the issues that we can be.
Thank you, Chair.
great, thanks. Yeah, Anna, Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chair. It was more of a comment. Just, I think it's probably quite assuring for us as members to see that the risks that the auditors have identified are probably the senior leadership team, and I think politically. Oh, sorry. And I think us as members aware of our biggest risks at the moment, which continues to be the challenge financially around children's services and adult social care, temporary accommodation, and then obviously a concern around having revenue income streams met because of the effects of what's happened in the last 2 years. So I think for me, I'm just quite assured that the auditors have not uncovered stuff that we didn't know as elected members, and as I'm sure the senior leadership team as well were aware. And we know, I'm sure we've got it within the pack, and the corporate risk register has all these very high up as well. So I guess that's assuring.
Yep, thanks for that. Any comments on that? I think, yeah. Ask, or are we in a position to move to approving this? I mean, the one disappointment I have big is that the government, we're also asked to approve, or implicitly asked to approve, the annual governance statement. And as I understand, that's a separate approval to the accounts. And I found it a very helpful summary of the risks that we face. The problem was, at the end of it, the date on which it was signed was September of 2021. And it does, to me, illustrate how important this whole process is, that it's timely. And if we're talking about something that was basically a year or at least 6 months, 8 months away, then we're talking about history rather than about current. And I just think it undermines both the political importance of it and the real accountability to the public. So I do think it just underlines how important it is that we really this time make sure, and I'm hoping the circumstances, Suresh and Stuart, that led to the delays will not affect the assessment of the year that's just ending well, the year it has ended, up to 22, and we really get the November delivery. I think it's very important that that happens. So that's all I wanted to add. So if there aren't, oh, yeah. Yeah, Councillor Gordon, do you want to come in?
Yeah.
Could you, yeah.
I suppose it's just really in relation to the cyber attack, as a sort of question for the auditors. Do you have any sort of additional advice for council really on any additional, implications of that, or anything else that we, need to sort of assess or uncover? Thank you. I appreciate it's going to be a more detailed report.
Yeah, I mean, specifically in terms of the report that we produced back in, I think it was December, wasn't it? We kind of issued that report. We are following that up because there were obviously some observations and recommendations in there. So we will be coming back with a more informed report. So probably best, rather than me trying to second guess what my cyber specialist will be reporting, for wait for that report.
Thank you.
Anything you want to add to that, Margaret?
I don't think I can really.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just on page 29, just looking at the other risks page, which have been mentioned already. They're saying that the ongoing impact of COVID on the costs of providing services, especially children's services, adult social care, temporary accommodation, revenue income streams such as council tax and business rates. I mean, these are all crucial areas for us to be considering. I'd just like to hear very, very briefly, I mean, a couple of minutes really, how we're planning to mitigate against those risks. Have we got just very briefly, if that's okay?
So certainly, thank you very much for that question, Councillor Smythe. And just so I'm clear on the time frame you're talking about, obviously we're looking to make sure that going forwards we protect as much as we can our ability to collect all those income streams. And you're absolutely right. What we have been doing is firstly making sure that additional support is put in place to make sure that residents who get into difficulties are actually supported to get into payment as quickly as they can. The last thing we want to do is see residents stack up arrears, get into real difficulties in terms of the amounts of support that they need, and then it's a harder task. So we invested significantly in, as we know, in terms of housing revenue account, particularly the support for residents around rent, and there needs to be more done on that space. In addition to that, on council tax and on housing benefits, the team have already been providing considerable support. And I was going to touch upon it in my briefing later, but we were successful in actually allocating all of the discretionary housing payment monies out for the financial year that's just closed, so 21-22, which wasn't without its challenges given where we were with the impact of the cyber attack. So that's really good news. In addition to that, on all the other hardship schemes, we've allocated more resources than we've previously done, and any underspends that we may have in the closed financial year will be carried forward. We're just at this time of the year going through the sort of year-end processes as people would expect. Thanks.
You happy with that? Any other comments on the annual accounts and the external auditors report? Suresh, it might be helpful just to hear your view about how the current audit is going, because obviously, while there have been unprecedented difficulties about the last audit, I think we're reassured that Mazars have also addressed their own issues in this, and it may be good just to hear how you feel that the commitment to the November delivery is standing up.
Yeah, so we discussed probably back in January actually with Ian and Jackie about the timetable for 21-22, which we've got a provisional timetable which allows us to complete our work and report to you in November. That covers all our kind of London Borough audits that we are in a position to, they are in a position to prepare accounts, and we are in a position to audit them. So yeah, we're getting back on track in terms of scheduling our work, making sure it's sufficiently resourced to be able to then meet end of November deadline for 2022.
Great, thank you for that. I'm sure Ian has picked that up as a reassurance that we're going to get the support we need over the next months. Very good. Well, with that, can I then put the recommendation, which is on page 4, that we approve the 2021 statement of accounts, subject obviously to the finalisation of the processes that Suresh has been talking about, and that the Group Director of Finance is authorised to approve the final statements subject to those updates. And secondly, to approve in its own right the annual government statement within the statement of accounts, which, as I said earlier, is obviously a separate recommendation. So with that, can I put it to members? Do I see approval? We do. A unanimous approval. Okay, thanks very much, Jackie, for that. And thanks, Suresh and Stuart, for your work on it. We look forward to those tidy ends being tidied up as soon as possible so we can get this off officially. Thank you. Right, let's move on to current performance report. Bruce, are you going to give us a rundown, or are you going to introduce? Oh no, sorry, Ian. Yes, you're going to give us an overview of the state of our account, of our finances.
Thanks for that, Chair. And just so colleagues on the call aren't thinking grief, we're going to have a half-an-hour presentation on the finances, given the agenda we've got tonight. I've agreed with the Chair that we'll keep it brief and just do a one-slide overview. So just bear with me a moment. I'll just make sure that we present. Great stuff. So very quickly, we're in the process of taking the final outturn position through the usual stages that it needs to go through. But I was pleased to update Cabinet in March that we've continued to see the overspend that we've been forecasting back in August of around £7 million continuing to go down. Pleasing to see that it's now below £5 million. Obviously, no one wants to see an overspend, particularly me, but I'm also conscious of the real challenges that we faced in the current financial year. So it's really pleasing to see the work that all colleagues on the call and Cabinet members have done to address the challenging financial position. The main areas of overspend won't be a surprise to members of this committee. They relate to the impact of COVID, pressures from the cyber attack, continuing pressures in social care, which I'm sure we'll talk about when we come on to the risk registers later, and just general challenges in some areas where we need to bring in income, but because of the long-standing impacts of the COVID pandemic, and we've seen some slippage in recovering some of those income streams. We're forecasting a break-even position on the HRA, but again, we're seeing significant cost pressures there, and in particular, we're seeing the challenges that, again, this committee is well familiar with in terms of the collection of rent income through a combination of factors, not just cyber, but the pandemic, but also the significant number of people we've seen move from being on housing benefits to now being on universal credit. And I think the challenges that brings with regards to bringing in collection. Thought it'd be useful just to update members where we got to with the spring statement. It confirmed expectations, really. There was no new announcements of significant resource for local authorities in terms of their core finance. But what we did see was a continuation of the Household Support Fund, and that saw Hackney be allocated an amount of the £500 million that was announced. Probably remind ourselves that we received £2.8 million for 2021-22, and we were successful in making sure all of that money was spent within the timelines that the government insisted we spend the money by. We're waiting to see the detail of what allocation we get for 22-23, but already we're putting in place plans to make sure that once we know what that allocation is, we'll be able to get that money out the door as quickly as possible. In addition to that, I'm sure all members on the call have seen the memo that myself, the head of revenues and the strategic director for customer and workplace sent out to all members this week in terms of the work that particularly the revenues and benefits team are doing to get support out. We're making good progress in starting payment of the £150 support to residents for the impact of the energy challenges, and certainly I would expect to see those people who pay us via direct debit starting to see that money come into their accounts in the coming week. Obviously the processes and the churn of all of that needs to work itself through. It's been really pleasing to see that the number of people wanting to pay the council by direct debit since we put out our promotion as part of the council tax billing cycle, because obviously it's a much better way for residents to pay us, much better way for us to get money, has increased significantly, and I'm hoping they'll all stay in the direct debit scheme once they've received £150. It makes it a much more efficient transaction on both parties. But I would also then draw members' attention to the next bullet point, and I think there's no real surprise in what I'm going to say now. This committee is well familiar with the forecasts that I've presented with the team over the coming, well, over the past 3-4 months, but in particular since the start of the pandemic, and we've been consistently forecasting challenging financial position going forwards and the increasing levels of uncertainty that exist. But what we have seen since we did that forecast back around Christmas, which then fed into the medium-term financial plan, is that the impact of inflationary pressures is real and is starting to really look as though it will go on much longer than was anticipated, I think, back in the sort of early part of the year. My intention is to take a further updated forecast to Cabinet in July, and we're doing a lot of work with all London boroughs to do a London-wide assessment of the impact of inflation that's caused by a whole range of factors, including the tragic events that are taking place in the Ukraine. Finally, and as we've just heard really, we're nearly there with the 2021 accounts, and work is well underway for 21-22. But the real message I want all members to take away, particularly on this committee, is that the need to focus and really focus our energies on maintaining our strong financial position is something we can't take our eye off the ball on, and it's going to be a real focus for those members who are elected as part of the next administration once the local election have taken place. And the finance team is ready and standing to work very closely with those elected to make sure that our financial position is maintained, because ultimately it's what enables us to provide the services to our residents.
Great, thanks for that, Ian. Great. I mean, clearly, just to emphasise the point Ian's been making, the considerable uncertainty over future funding is reflected also in the situation facing our residents and our cost position. And unfortunately, I do think, just following up from what Ian says, the new administration is going to be faced with a considerable period of uncertainty and difficulty. The pressures, particularly around housing, and I think the pressures we're about to hear on children's and adults funding, are going to be really intense and difficult over the next period.
Yeah, I mean, thanks very much for that update, Ian. It's quite sobering to hear it. I was just wondering whether you could comment a little bit further on the sort of cost of living crisis and the impact on our residents and consequently on council finances, and also how that's impacting on the council as a sort of economic player and a consumer as well, sort of how the rising prices, what sort of impact that's having. Thank you.
So I'm really glad that you've framed the question like that, because when I've talked internally about the cost of living crisis, often it's thought of from the residents' perspective entirely, but actually the council itself is in many ways a significant consumer, and it equally faces significant pressures on its own resources that residents face as well. So absolutely what we're very focused on is making sure that from a resident's perspective, we're really, particularly on those areas where we rely upon residents paying income, so that would be housing rents, council tax, businesses on business rates, but other services, making sure that our processes and approach to collection recognises the need to collect that money, but is also sensitive to the challenge that people are facing. As I outlined in my response to question from Councillor Smythe, we've worked really hard to make sure that we're paying out as much, if not more, than all of the hardship funds that the council itself has, and from its own resources, and in particular from the resources we have received from government around the household support fund. We've made sure we've got that money out the door really quickly, and on the council tax, £150 energy rebate, we're working really hard to get that money out the door, but also being mindful to some of the things that I'm sure we've all read in the papers around potential scams that are taking place in terms of what we have seen in other parts of the country, not seen them here, but making sure that residents are confident in their approach to addressing, to interacting with the council. From the council's perspective, we face many of the cost pressures that residents do. Energy costs alone are something which we're a big consumer of. And a good example of that will be an article that appeared in the Local Chronicle last week, highlighting the significant pressures that the leisure centre, leisure services teams across the country are coming under in terms of the costs of heating swimming pools, all the things that you would expect that we see in our own homes. And in Hackney, whilst it's not a direct like-for-like comparison because of the opening of the New Britannia Centre, but when I've looked with the team at the numbers from where we were in 2019, which is probably a reasonable base point to use given what's happened over the last 2 years to what we're forecasting now, we're seeing a cost increase from around £1 million back then to around £2.8 million on our core leisure centres. But I also think it's important in those examples for us not to lose sight of potentially an opportunity that arises. So what I've also been working with colleagues on is addressing ways to see whether it now is the time for us to accelerate some of our ways to mitigate those reliances upon those types of energy, see whether, for example, in the Lido, there's ways of bringing in quicker the sort of heat source pumping, all the more environmentally sustainable measures to generate the energy needs that those facilities need. Now, obviously, that needs to be properly stress tested, needs to be affordable and stand up to a business case. But I don't think necessarily when you have a crisis, you should default to a retrenchment position. You should, at that point, try and be more creative and more ambitious, and that's certainly what we're looking to do within the challenging envelope that we're having. I know that colleagues on the call, Helen and Jackie in particular, when we talk about their Directorate risk registers, will highlight some of the very real challenges that particularly the adult social care sector is facing, and that's not helped, is it, by the impact of cost of living on the wage costs of people who work in those sectors. We're very quickly seeing, aren't we, the comparators and the opportunities for people to do other jobs, being a real competition, and so we're having to be very live to that as well. But no, it's something which as a council we're really focused on, and we'll be bringing an updated report to Cabinet in July on our updated medium-term financial forecast.
Thanks, Ian. Yes, Emma.
Oh, were you first? Thank you, Chair. Ian, I don't know if you're able to answer this or not, but it's just something I'm reflecting on, given that I think every one of us that are in employment will all be seeing a reduction this month due to the 1% on national insurance. And I acutely, as somebody that works with the NHS, we're acutely aware of that, around how we've happened to, whilst we've always wanted to provide good services to people, I'm wondering whether or not the council will be wanting to adopt a similar approach to wanting to really turbo boost that we're giving value to money for our residents, in terms of really trying to triangulate our feedback from our residents on the services that we provide, and using that sometimes as a driver for what you've talked about, which is around maybe we are needing to really turbocharge some of that transformation stuff. So whilst it may actually be expensive to deliver, it's actually not actually fit for purpose, or it may not be reaching the quality that we would expect for our residents. So I wondered whether or not that's been thought of, and is there something potentially as us as members, and sort of potentially if we're still together elected and on Audit Committee, whether or not that's something the committee wants to look at, as well as maybe on a focus on value for money for our residents as well. Because I think whilst not want to make it too consumery and too sort of, you know, I think there's definitely going to be that that feeling for residents, because I think, I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone that, you know, we've all been hit in regard to the rising costs without actually doing anything extra additional in our own lives, if that makes sense. So, and we know that when we do have sort of economic challenges, people can become polarised with their views as well, and people do become more, their expectations will increase as well if they start to feel it more acutely.
No, certainly very happy to answer that question. I think for me, a good area where we're doing a lot of work to see if we can sort of stimulate the market, for want of a better way, is, you know, this committee is well familiar with the significant pressures that exist on the SEND budget. You know, the council's done great work to lobby for the proper funding of SEND cost pressures with other councils, but it still falls well short. So what we have been looking at here in Hackney is seeing how we can effectively try and create and invest in facilities that mean we're not so reliant upon the private sector. Now, that won't be without its challenges. You know, we're fortunate that we have sites available that we can invest in and redevelop. We then need to make sure that they work for us and actually deliver the outcomes that we expect. But that's just one way that I've sort of I see us trying to intervene in a market that otherwise was going the wrong way in terms of just charging local authorities more and more. I think just in picking up your point on the increase in national insurance contribution, and just so the committee's aware, I think when we came to our last meeting, we were at the point where we hadn't had the local government pay award agreed for the last financial year. The payroll team, worked closely with colleagues in finance, did really great work to make sure that the pay award to Hackney staff was paid before the new national insurance contributions kicked in, which would have been in April. So you'd have effectively seen the two net off. That wasn't the case in all local authorities. So, you know, I'm pleased to be able to announce they were able to get that one over the line, because that was a concern, I think, when we came to this meeting at the last point.
Great, thank you. Councillor Smythe.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ian, for you know, updating us on the sort of ground source heat pumping technology for our swimming pools and leisure centres. I mean, I think it's an idea I've been pushing for a long time, but I think it's definitely the right thing to be thinking about under the current situation. And I know that you'll manage it really well. I was just intrigued about the household support fund, because you said, it said on the slide we received 2.8 million. I'm just wondering, I mean, you said a lot of that's gone out the door. How much of that has gone out the door, and basically where has it gone?
So just so I'm clear, all of that £2.8 million from the last financial year went out the door. I've got colleagues on the call, Naim's on the call, he'll be able to give you an update on specifically what that money's been spent on, because there's a considerable number of items, and we're very happy to present to circulate to committee a sort of summary note of what's happened there. As I said, we don't know yet what our share of the 500 million for 22-23 is. But we can only predict it'll be broadly in the same sort of ballpark as what we had before.
Great, thanks very much. Suggest we need to move on now. So, Bruce, now is your opportunity.
Thank you, Chair. I think Ian's covered off a number of it, but there's Ian, sorry, I don't know if you were going to update on sickness as well, because I know. Yeah, because obviously sickness is one of the areas of that you've raised there, which is continuing to rise, which is a mixture of things which some is direct COVID sickness, but others is COVID related things, which is obviously people having delays to NHS procedures, etc., which are a result of COVID, which is then causing prolonged sickness as well. Other areas to highlight, obviously, I think across the board, across rents, council tax, and NDR, etc. Income is those from PCNs is up, and one other area probably just to briefly touch is the continued sort of pressure in the planning service to to get the number of sort of planning applications out the door within the desired timescale because of the staffing issues across the board. They're still hitting the sort of the statutory deadline, so statutory targets that are set by government. It's just we're up against it on our own local targets, but we're hitting those national statutory targets quite comfortably still. And Chair, so just also to sort of place out there that we are about to start some work on a wider look at sort of measures of performance management across the board, and that's probably some work we can take forward with the new chair of Audit Committee to make sure that we bring the right information in the future as we look towards a more sort of outcome sort of focus on things, so not all outputs.
Right. The other areas that I wanted to highlight were obviously around housing, and the debt and arrears both, and particularly comes back to this issue about rent arrears continuing to go up, and it looks as if the increase in the final period, Q3, is greater than the increase in Q2. In other words, it seems to be an increasing rate of arrears, and obviously that is of very considerable concern. I mean, I think this report highlights the areas you've dealt with. One of them, Bruce. The other is around arrears and housing and council tax income, which obviously is of crucial concern for the council's viability. I appreciate that it's a very full report on what's being done. I don't know if any either you, Bruce, or anyone else, Deirdre was talking about it earlier, can add to anything in this area. Deirdre, please.
Okay, in the circulated presentation, what we have seen a slight reduction from the end of Q3 down to 15.2 million, and that was the position week ending the 3rd of April. So obviously there's going to be a lot more validation work and as part of the close down process. But included in that slide are also some productivity measures about the contact that housing staff are going to have with people in arrears. So you know, I mean, at the moment on the slide, the contact did go down over the winter period, and that could have been a combination. You know, obviously we closed down for that Christmas period, and there was a bit of absence due to having to isolate because of COVID infections. But there has been 7,000 contacts since Manage My Arrears went live, and we started to see a pickup in contact between January and February. They reduced again in March. I think that was because people were taking leave, because they had to use the leave up. But Steve has set a target for the team of 1,400 home visits per month. And we have, you know, so we have that more contact, that knocking on the doors to try and encourage people, to pay their rent. There's been a lot more notices served and reminder letters going out. So we are picking up the pace on recovery procedures, and also they work hand in hand with the financial inclusion team. So where you know, families and households need support, they will be signposted to where they can get support. But what we'd be able to do going forward throughout this year is to measure that productivity target of that contact stats and how that impacts on the level of rent arrears going forward.
Yeah, thanks. Can I just follow that. I mean, clearly contact is essential to find out what the reasons are and to be able to react to it. And I absolutely appreciate your focusing on that. I guess the question is what the results have been. Have you got any sort of feel for the Q4 performance? Because as I say, the Q3 performance showed an accelerating problem. Any feel for the Q4, whether, in other words, you can see some impact of this increased visit schedule?
We've seen some marginal improvement, because we've got the rent arrears level at week, at the week ending 3rd of April, we were sitting on 15.2 million, and that's going from a high of about 15.9 million. But the rent arrears fluctuates throughout the month, so we've seen a small reduction. So it's reduced in the 8 weeks from February to March. We've seen a reduction in 500,000. So we will be tracking the impact of those visits on the rent arrears. But now we've got Manage My Arrears as a much more viable product that we can use. We get collecting the stats and actually see the impact of those contact arrangements.
Okay, I find that reassuring. So could we conclude that we've reached peak debt?
I would love to say we've reached peak debt, but we've got. I think we've built the Manage My Arrears. Rent Sense will be coming in. We've got trackable productivity data. It's arranged on a patch basis, so we can actually track down to individual teams as to where are your contacts, what are you doing, and Steve is keen on the new model of housing, neighbourhood housing management, and that is about staff being out and about and making contact with residents, knocking on the doors. I think one of the key things on the stats, though, is that it is the self-payers that have actually seen the biggest increase in rent arrears. So there is you've got the can't pays and the won't pays, and we're going to target those people that can afford to be paying their rent. They've just sort of like stopped throughout, taking advantage of the cyber attack, to be perfectly honest, in the pandemic. So
Right, thanks for that. I'm beginning to be reassured. Councillor, okay.
Thanks, Chair. It's just, I think it was the comment that was made around the performance KPIs that we've got here, because one of the things that flags out for me is clearly sickness is sickness. It's a bit like trying to measure sort of maternity leave. You can't, there's some predictors for sickness, clearly, if you've got an aging workforce, and if you've got the unfortunate situation where your workforce is sustaining illness and injury in the workplace, which hopefully isn't happening within Hackney. So what I think I would suggest, and I wondered whether or not this has been explored as well, is clearly when these people aren't here, we have an absence, and what are we doing to fill that absence, which I suspect is that we are then spending on what is known in the trade as temporary staffing from other agencies. And I wondered whether or not that is something that we need to maybe look at, because there are tools that we know in other organisations you can use to try to sort of mitigate what people are doing when there is an absence from your normal established workforce. I mean, I'm yet again going to bring up the fact that I don't know where the workforce strategy is. Do you remember we asked for this, didn't we, back in September, Nick, for it to come back? I don't know if the designated director has responded at all to that. I don't think it's Ian. Or Dawn or any of the other SLT that are here. And I just wondered whether or not that's something that as a council needs to be looked at. What do we do when we have absences, and what are we doing to mitigate within our existing workforce that the default isn't to ring up Reed or whatever well-known agency that the council use?
I'll address the work that corporate leadership team's doing on sickness now, as I think that will hopefully answer Councillor Lynch's question. So obviously this is not an area we haven't always been focusing on. It's had its challenges in the last 2 years because of what's been going on. But there's a number of actions that with colleagues in HR that are being taken forward. Firstly, it's to make sure that all group directors and senior leaders are clear on the position within relation to their teams about what the position is, and in particular any long-standing cases. So I've been working with colleagues in HR to identify what I classify as the sort of 50 top cases of those that ultimately contribute to this number in aggregate. And there will be some that are quite tragic, but actually at some point they need to be addressed and dealt with, and it's making sure that those processes have been started. So
like redeployment or early retirement,
absolutely,
or
and
things
also
like that,
early retirement, but also ill health retirement. There's quite a number which I've had some really tragic cases in F&R of people who've unfortunately picked up illnesses that they're not going to recover from. And it's making sure that we've put in place the support to assist them to make the choices they need to do, but also to ensure that managers feel comfortable in doing that, because that is not a space that any of us would normally want to be in. So a piece of work is being done to identify the sort of 50 top cases to make sure that we've got proper grip on the addressing of those. And I think when some of those are worked through, I would expect that to have an impact on the number in its aggregate level, because I just know from looking at my own Directorate's numbers, there probably are a relatively small number of cases that significantly contribute to the overall number. And it's making sure that's addressed. In addition to that, also making sure managers have the detail and the information they need to see those cases where people, either always take a Monday off or a Friday off. All the cases that all of us who've been managers for many years will be familiar with are addressed, but also then the action is taken to address that. But I'm happy to do a more full update to the next iteration of this committee on where we are with this, because it probably feels it might be something that as a council we want to explore in this committee as a deep dive item, given the impact and the challenges we're facing financially and as an organisation. But I think I'd also say that it's not a pattern that we're not seeing in other local authorities as well. 2 years of the pandemic, obviously in Hackney's case the cyber overlaid, and I think I would also add that sometimes benchmarking and comparisons in this space has its strengths but also has its flaws, because a council which has a predominantly in-source workforce has a lot more roles within the scope of the calculation than those that significantly outsources as well. So it's also important just to understand some of those what I always call apples with apples comparisons, and whether actually you're comparing an apple with a pear or something.
I'm just very conscious of the time. We need to make progress. Councillor Gordon, you've got a question.
Thanks, Chair. Just sort of very briefly, in relation to the backlog in processing housing benefit, I note that that's not being reported, but it's going to start reporting again. So what sort of picture do you expect to see? Sorry, it's in relation to the backlog of processing housing benefits. Yeah.
Clarify in detail where we are with that, but we're expecting, in terms of the ones affected by the cyber attack, to principally be cleared in the next few weeks, and then actually we'll be largely back to, for changing circumstances, as close to business as usual as we had been. There will always be, I think we've got to be realistic, that there will always be some historic legacy challenging cases where things are having just to be worked through, and the period of time where the system was out of action, where we had to then go back to a previous version, but there was things in between that the team doesn't have records for, will prove challenging, but we are very close to getting to the place we need to be on that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really good news for residents, because it's obviously been a very challenging time for a lot of them. Thank you.
Great, thanks, colleagues. Can we leave that to, if there are no other points? I do think this report will need to be filled out and reviewed as part of the next administration. I think both in terms of data, the importance of some of the key issues, and the data sources, things are changing. So I would again commend my successor to have a look at this framework. I think it's been a useful experiment, and it's gone has allowed us to see quite a lot of how things are happening in the council, but it clearly could needs a review. Great. Okay, let's move on. And the next item is and we brought up the Treasurer's management report right to the beginning to prevent poor old Freddie having to wait for hours and hours. Freddie, do you want to say something about introduce this report?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah. So the Treasury management update for this time is a quarterly update compared to law. So it's a quite short report, and so I'm going to summarize the report quickly. There's not much changes from the last update. Our investment balances end of March stand at 125 million. Borrowing hasn't changed. We haven't done any new borrowing in the last 3 months. Our investments, we have again the credit quality of our investments are still between A+ and A, which is as per our TMS. Plus, looking at the market, how things are, we are keeping an eye on all our investments. We're just making sure there's no direct investments in Russia or Belarus. So that's one of the key things. We are working with our Treasury advisors just to make sure, and plus, with where we invest in money market funds, just to make sure there is no direct investments. And if there are any direct investments, they need to highlight us straight away. So those are the key things we are working on. And like I said, there's no other major changes from the last quarter. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly, I think the level of our investments in Russian assets or whatever is quite low anyway. It started from a very low point. Could you just clarify what that point was? I think it was, I read it was somewhere around 1% or 2% or something of our fund. Is that right?
Yes, Jackie can answer. Yeah.
I think the figure you're referring to is probably from the pension fund, actually, rather than 0.5%. Yeah.
Okay. Any other points to Freddie? I mean, I guess we're running into stormy times, Freddie, in the next year. In terms of the impact of particularly stagflation on both us and the marketplace.
So we keep an eye on the inflation, which is basically, we know the inflation is we assume it's going to be 8% in April. Interest rates are going out, so we work quite closely with our advisors, keep an eye on these things, look at the impact, if on the borrowings, on the interest rates, on the investments. So that's what we do on a regular basis. So it's quite frequent now with the advisors and see what the impact are on our investments.
Thanks for that. Okay, well, I was so eager to get Pradeep in that I overlooked the two aspects of the performance report that we'll come back to. One is capital and the other is corporate risk. So we'll come back to that. But thanks, Pradeep, and we can now let you go early at this time.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Right, can we turn back to Jackie on the capital?
Yeah,
I'm particularly anxious for you to try and distinguish between some of the events that have caused the capital programme to diverge and whether our efforts to improve the estimation have had any effect. It was quite hard to tell, obviously, from this. And I'm just wondering if you, as part of your report, you could address that.
Yeah, and I think that is a very good point, actually. That's why we've tried to provide a more detailed breakdown of the forecast versus what the original budget was in the last couple of updates to Audit Committee. And what I've done this time is try to pull out some themes, because it was clear that quite a lot of the movement was to do with some very sort of clear themes. And one of them was around, not surprisingly, construction industry inflation and the fact that tender prices were coming back above estimates and therefore not being able to proceed with those schemes as planned, sort of subject to further viability reviews, etc. And I've in the cover report on page 30 of the pack, I've just tried to name some of the schemes specifically where that's impacted. We've also had a significant impact of the of COVID-19 ongoing. So when we set the budget for 21, 22, it would have been sort of back end of 19, would it be 19? Would it be a good way before the beginning of the financial year? And we didn't have the knowledge about how far COVID was going to impact into that financial year. So again, that's not one of the main reasons. But there's also external factors which come into play. So things around sort of Section 106 highways work, where you can only actually do that work when a scheme comes to a certain point, and that those schemes are potentially being delivered by external bodies. And similarly around the Britannia project, where we was planning to sort of begin the implementation of phase 2A, and that was always subject to a Section 7 application, which was then denied, and we've had to reprofile the project. And similarly, things like the Disabled Facilities Grant, which is very much dependent on the applications that we get from sort of external parties. So I think a large proportion of it is to do with external factors, but that's not to say we can't still make some improvements in terms of our profiling.
So is your feel that our estimation within the constraints that you've just talked about has been improved as over the period?
I would say marginally, and I would say that if you was to take out all those factors, you would get to within the target that we set.
Reassuring. Okay. Any other points on the capital budget? I mean, again, this is such an important issue. I mean, one of the real concerns I had coming back to housing was that we're having to reduce one of the reasons for reducing the housing capital was in order to fill the deficit. That will then have an impact on our repairs and state of stock, which will come back and bite us in terms of higher repair bills and so on. So there are many things going on under the surface of these capital budgets that are of great importance to this council. I do again think that it's been a major step forward in terms of monitoring this form of expenditure, and we should continue it. Right, okay, if there are no other points on that, can I turn then to corporate risk? And Matt, can you introduce this?
Sure. So you have in the papers the summary scorecard of the main corporate risks. The full version of this will be ready for June's Audit Committee and be seen by CLT in May. So from the last version, which you saw in January, the main risks and overall themes do remain the same, although these are clearly very tumultuous times, and risks are constantly being affected by both internal and external events. The pandemic still presents a very major risk, although the situation is immeasurably better than it has been, as reflected in a slightly reduced score. And the cyber attack risk remains, even though so much positive recovery and reconstruction work has been done, vulnerabilities still remain and impacts on services continue to be felt, and there is no quick fix to this. There's a range of financial risks on the register, constantly changing with the ever-increasing pressures on the council's budget, and now impacts from what's happening in Ukraine will be increasingly felt. Again, this will be reflected in the full version, but recent updates, as just mentioned a minute ago, do suggest no direct exposures for Treasury investments, MMFs, to Russian assets. Current situations will only add to the already existing supply chain risks and the overall cost of living crisis. Amongst other high-scoring risks, there are numerous ones from adults' health and integration and children and education, but obviously they're on the agenda shortly, so it's best to leave those for then.
Thanks very much. Any questions on risks? I mean, I do find it slightly surprising that this is, if you look at the big picture, we see an overall lowering of risk, partly because of the COVID point you've been making. And yet I look forward and I see more risk, and I'm just a bit taken aback, if you like, by the thought that maybe, why aren't those risks, stagflation, people's income, pressure on arrears and so on, why isn't that somewhere reflected in this this matrix?
Yeah, I mean, all of those things
They will, but they will emerge, because I do think if I'm looking in the future, I'm seeing more red, and how it appears, I think, is really important that we try and sort out in the future report. Can we move on then to one of the key items of the evening, which is the Directorate risk register, firstly for children and education, and then adults and health. Who's going to kick off on this?
Good evening, that will be me, Jackie Burke, for Children and Education.
Great. Yep, go ahead, Jackie. Thanks for that.
So I'll just kind of gallop through the main highlights and then leave open room for some questions. So just in terms of our risk, you will see that there's a new risk which has come from the Child Q report and the findings of that, which has led us to revisit the management of partnership agencies to ensure the well-being of children. And that will be largely through the Safeguarding Children partnership, but also, and obviously through also with schools from our education department. And that is mainly around ensuring that all agencies working with children have a safeguarding first agenda, and they have a my child mindset. Is this good enough for my child? You will see from the report that there was some recommendations for policy and procedural change, but actually, you know, we have a strongly of the belief that this is about culture far more than it is about policies. Just moving on, in terms of cyber, we, as you know, that's had a huge impact on children's services. It was mitigated through the development of a minimum viable product, which was our interim recording system. But that had risks of its own, which meant that we weren't able to produce our statutory returns to the DfE. And also in terms of inspection readiness, it certainly impedes our ability to show our management grip. There have been a number of other risks that we've mitigated through making some changes to practice, but I'm happy to report that on the 4th of April this year, we returned to the Mosaic system, which is now hosted in the cloud by the provider, which is the Asset Group. And that means that all our recording systems in children's social care are now absolutely compliant with the statutory requirements, and we will be able to complete our statutory returns for the years 22-23. In terms of some of the demand management is an issue for us in children's social care, and we've made some significant changes to our front door in the first instance, and we're also making some changes to our delivery of early help, because we recognise that if we help families earlier, then they are less likely to need more complex support. So in terms of, so that's part of our demand management strategy, but you will see is a considerable risk is around the care placements. So whilst we've reduced the number of children coming into care overall, many of you will be aware, it's all in the newspapers at the moment, of the price of individual care placements for children in private children's homes. You know, we have a good track record of really optimising the use of our foster care placements, and my team can be commended for that, but we don't have sufficient foster carers. So we do use private children's homes, and they are extortionate, and we are, there's the care review, which is a government review, is addressing some of these issues, but every local authority nationally is battling with those costs. Also, in terms of our no recourse to public funds, families where they're living in destitution, which is a financial risk to us, we are confident that we're fulfilling our statutory duties whilst protecting resources and avoiding excess costs. In education, again, something that's subject of quite wide national debate and currently subject of a green paper from the Department of Education. So special education needs and disabilities is a huge financial pressure for us, and it's a national issue as well. So we have put in a number of different strategies in terms of how we're trying to manage this. So we've done a restructure of our service to enable better outcomes for children and better use of our resources. We've got an improvement plan for our SEND provision. We've got an improvement in the timeliness of our assessing children who require education, health and care plans. And we've got a huge piece of work that we're doing with our schools and settings, which is about having more inclusive education environments and also helping children far earlier so that we don't need to have a statutory process, that we can give them the support earlier on. Again, in education, our traded services is a risk, and that's currently under review, and we will respond to any of the findings from review to ensure that it doesn't create any financial risk for us as a department. Again, another focus in the media at the moment is, again, in response to the white paper for education, is unregistered education settings. And we know that in the Haredi community, there is an issue in the Stamford Hill area whereby some children are receiving a formal education in an unregistered setting. So we have a strategy and we work quite closely with Ofsted around those settings. And also there's a risk of children who are missing from education. We have a strategy around that. But again, for the Haredi community, this is fairly significant in terms of not being children not accessing the full curriculum through registered settings. Currently, there's an issue across London of school place planning. There is a huge issue in terms of the falling roles in reception and year one classes and primary schools. And this is causing some significant financial pressures, and particularly in some of our smaller education settings. And we're working with the sector to mitigate those pressures. And we are looking at a refreshed schools estate strategy, which enables us to use some of that school spaces to provide early help and in-house support for children with special education needs and disabilities. I'll pause there, and they're the kind of key issues, and I'll pause there for questions, Chair.
Really, thanks very much, Jackie. A comprehensive report. I mean, and quite an alarming one in the sense that there are an awful lot of pressures in terms of our ability, not least to maintain standards. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of SEND, things like EHCP plans now not fulfilled, pressure to reduce standards or say, and I suppose that the concern is that we're being forced to lower our offer in terms of service and support. And I'm hearing your reassurance that that's not yet the case, that we can, even under the current pressures, maintain those standards.
So certainly our ambition is to provide support for children far earlier, rather than the EHC, the Education, Health and Care Plan, being seen as the golden ticket to receive resources. And also just in terms of making optimum use of the school estates we have to make sure we've got some much more robust in-house offer rather than relying on private providers and the non-maintained independent sector to provide placements for some of our children. And as I said, this is a national pressure, so we're no different to anywhere else. But we, but that means as well, we're no different from anywhere else, and that we really have to have a focus on this, not least for our children. And the financial pressures is one thing, but we're not confident we're getting the best outcome for children anyway in terms of the spend in this particular area. So we have greater confidence in the strategy we've more recently adopted, which will be about releasing help earlier, making better use of our estates, so that children get the help they need to be able to access the curriculum in a far swifter and more compassionate way.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. The early intervention is absolutely the key to this. Okay, colleagues. Sorry, Councillor Gordon, Councillor Alex,
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jackie, for a very comprehensive report. Just a couple of things from me. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously encouraging to hear about the SEND strategy, but I mean, this obviously remains one of the maximum levels of risk on our risk register. So it's and it's a very ongoing crisis. Not all of it under our own control as a local authority. I mean, it's obviously very positive to hear about the steps you're taking to address this. But I think in terms of your remark about EHCPs being seen as a golden ticket, I think really what has to happen in relation to the majority of SEN provision in terms of SEN support, in that parents need to be reassured that they are getting a sort of robust, accountable system, and that is and they're getting a full range of opportunities and reporting back for their children. I mean, that has to be part of the framework and the offer for our children. I can see you nodding, so I think hopefully you're in agreement with me there. I think my other question really was in relation to school exclusions, which and it's encouraging to see that you're flagging up the CYP scrutiny report in relation to this. And I just really, I mean, this is obviously something that just have considerable risk in terms of the individuals and the and our reputational damage, and I think our community cohesion as well, really, as an educational community. And just maybe wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit more on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. So in terms of your first question, I think the current system for EHCP, it seems to set the local authority up in opposition with parents who are seeking help, and that's just not a really, and that's not how we feel about it. But I think in terms of the whole tribunal system, I think it feels like a very difficult thing to be in if you're a parent, if you're a child. So certainly in terms of how we take this forward, it is with compassion. It is with compassion for our children, with compassion for our parents, and what we want is for all of our children to be able to access the curriculum in a way that maximises and optimises their opportunities. So there will be some, as you're aware, there's a green paper which is out at the moment, which we're poring over madly at the moment, which actually picks up on some of the issues that as leaders in local government, we're quite well rehearsed on, and it does pick up on those. So I'm optimistic we could end up with a better system, but I'm very cautious about it. But we still need enabling children to get help quicker, so that they can access the curriculum. But absolutely, it needs to be a robust and accountable system, and one with, and I keep using the word compassion because I think that's absolutely critical. In terms of school exclusions, as you're aware, we produce quite a comprehensive action plan in respect of school exclusions, and our work and with our anti-racism planning is certainly focusing on outcomes for our Black and mixed heritage boys, which tend to be overrepresented, not tend to be, they are overrepresented in our school exclusions. So from a number of places where we're having a focus on this, clearly this is one where, again, we have to have a level of influence and rather than direction. But I'm confident that our schools are going to get behind us with this, and we are looking at some quite creative ways of engaging the child's voice in some of the solutions to what we do about exclusion, what we do about disruptive behaviour, and also as you'll be aware that there's a correlation between children with special education needs and exclusion as well. So hopefully some of the work we do around inclusion will dovetail into the exclusion work itself. We violent agreement to think that an exclusion for a permanent exclusion for a child is a significant safeguarding risk, and that's what we've got to try and stop those wherever we can.
Great, thanks for that. And Councillor Nims, you want to come in?
Thanks, Chair. It won't take a moment. It was just a comment around the biggest, one of the other risks around making sure our pupils in unregistered settings, and just to say, you mentioned it in your report, but just to welcome, the Chief Inspector of Ofsted last week. It obviously talked about the new powers that Ofsted had now in regard to that, and so hopefully that will impact on the risks that we have within the borough. So it was good to see that as well.
Yes, thank you. We do work very closely with Ofsted. So when we discover, if we suspect there's an unregistered setting, we have a rapid meeting with them, and they will go out and inspect, and they wear body-worn cameras, and we will go with them. And we've had some very robust conversations with them about, this, because it's education's one thing, but children being in unsafe settings is quite another. So we work very closely with Ofsted, and they have, I think Jim Gamble, who's the chair of our Safeguarding Children Partnership, has been a very strong voice in pushing this agenda with government. He's been relentless. So I think credit to Jim that this is kind of really starting to have legs, as it were.
Great, thanks for that. Sorry, Anna, we need to move on. Yeah. Councillor Smythe.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points. 5.2 on page 71, in relation to Child Q, we say we're working with partnership agencies, to ensure the well-being of our children, taking a safeguarding first approach. I mean, I think we should have been taking a safeguarding first approach all the way down the line. I presume those agencies that you refer to involve the police as well. Are we talking to the police about this? That's the first point. And then on exclusions, in Glasgow, I know that we've got an action plan in place, and in Glasgow they basically abolished pupil referral units, and now they have enhanced nurture units. It may be worth looking at what they've done in Scotland in relation to that, because it's quite crucial in regards to exclusions. It's an issue I've been discussing with Councillor Gordon and colleagues for quite a long time. And then finally, on the school place planning aspect, the surplus places in primary schools, page 75, projected surplus secondary school places, there is a sentence in there that does worry me, and it says, this will result in financial pressure on secondary schools and threaten their long-term viability. Could you just talk to that? Because that's quite strong language. Thank you.
So if I just take them in turn, so when we say agencies, so there's the Safeguarding Children Partnership is a statutory partnership, and the statutory partners are the clinical commissioning group, so that's health, the police, and myself as Director of Children's Services. So we are the three key agencies. And in terms of the safeguarding first approach, absolutely, that's, it's the Children Act 1989 states that the promoting and safeguarding the welfare of children is paramount. But as you saw in Child Q, it was subsumed by the kind of potential criminality aspects. So it's about being absolutely clear that we should be always looking at what the safeguarding issues are before we start thinking, is this child a criminal or not? And it's just about remembering and refreshing and revisiting that. So it's always been our priority, but it is about revisiting that and making sure we have the absolute balance in the right place. On the school place planning, so on the exclusions, we have a really fantastic pupil referral unit in terms of its kind of state-of-the-art building. It was just formally opened earlier on, just last year. And we have developed an outreach approach, because we are wanting not to have exclusions, so we want to do more inclusion work and using that as a resource. And we're actually part of a government, a DFE pilot at the moment, which is about really having some joined up work with parents and having a clinical team around children who are at risk of exclusions. So, and I think that might come from the enhanced nurture units, but I agree with you, it's a much nicer thing to call them. So, absolutely. School place planning. So, in terms of secondary schools, as you'll probably be aware that there's the DFE runs a school census in the autumn term, and the funding for the school is per capita per child, and it's so in terms of all of our schools, and it's not just secondary schools, so we're facing the crisis at the moment with some of our primary schools, and we're having conversations with them, and as I said, in terms of some of our school estate strategy, and as the current cohort starts to move through, we will be having conversations with secondary schools and doing some more longitudinal looking at our student place planning on the basis of what we know from the falling roles currently. So it of course it has financial, if we have fewer pupils, it has financial implications. So at some point in the future with secondary schools, we may need to look at either reducing the numbers of forms or merging schools, but that is quite a long way off and we haven't done the modelling for that yet. But we are embarking on it.
I've now got everyone wanting a second bite. Can you make it quick? Because
Chair,
I'm just conscious we've got the whole adult
A
area
follow-up
to
question
cover.
before Councillor Smythe spoke was actually very relevant, because it was to Jackie to say if Jackie was in a position to support the new administration, because I think some of the unfortunate instances that have happened within the borough and some of the responses to it from members may be that there needs to be a more refined and more clearer training for members around how safeguarding works within our borough, and the important role, as you said, of Jim Gamble and others within the safeguarding board, because I think people, and it sort of shows, no disrespect, Councillor Smythe, but one of the questions that you've asked Jackie is that she's had to then sort of spend time detailing what safeguarding process is. And I think for us as elected members, one of our biggest responsibilities is looked after children and safeguarding. It's a standard statutory duty that we have as a council, to me, and so that was why I had to intervene at that point.
Great,
because I would very much welcome that in the next administration.
Okay, can I ask Councillor Gordon, Councillor Smythe to their points, and then we'll come back to Jackie to answer them.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I totally agree with what Councillor Lynch has said. I mean, but I was just going to ask, and we're not going to solve it here, a different point. I mean, obviously, the costs in terms of looked after children are, as you've rightly indicated, staggering, and unsustainable, and quite a lot of it's beyond our control. I mean, I think going forward, I'm sure everyone will agree that's something that has to be very much in our near focus, really, in trying to mitigate those costs, and not leaving any stones unturned in relation to sort of planning to prevent those escalating costs. So we're not going to solve it here, obviously, but so I'm going there.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think it was just the word in terms of school place planning of viability, really. The long-term viability of many other primary schools will be affected. The long-term viability of secondary schools, it's quite a strong word, really, because viability means it's, are we talking about closing down schools here, really? I mean, that's really what we're talking about, isn't it?
Well, that's we have to have the possibility in our sites, and which is in terms of the school estate strategy, it's clearly not something we would ever want to do, but we're using some of this as an opportunity to help us rethink some of our SEND provision and to utilise the capacity we've got to support more of our children in borough and in borough placements. And we have we're confident that schools will be happy to do that, and it enables them to be more sustainable.
Great, thanks for that. Well, your report has stirred a lot of interest here, Jackie, and rightly so. I guess my concern is one of the issues you've made, which is resources that are coming into this not matching need, and the long-term implications of that in a whole variety of settings. And that's, I think, something that is where we're going to be at the front edge of issues, along with adult care, in the future, in terms of the council's services. So I think this is an area we will continually come back to, and want to hear from you how that dilemma of resource, standards and need are reconciled. Great, thanks very much indeed. Unless there are any other pressing points, I suggest we now move on to, is it Helen who's going to give a report on adult? Thanks very much, Jackie, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I think following on from Jackie's reports and the comments just made, the single biggest risk really when we're looking at adult social care is around resources. So our risks remain largely consistent with what we reported last year, and actually our position around being able to respond to the cyber attack has improved significantly, and we too will be implementing or re-implementing Mosaic this year. But the financial challenges that come both with COVID and increased demand are significant. And that's been then compounded by the effect of inflation and cost of living pressures, particularly on our market. So whilst we have pressures on us as a council, we also have a very significant provider market, and that provider market is feeling already the significant cost of those pressures, particularly around the ability to attract and retain staff. But also in terms of, for example, our residential care settings, feeling the impact of the increase in energy prices. And that in turn is then passed on to us in terms of costs of the placements that we make. I think the other thing to highlight, particularly with risks that we see on the horizon in adult social care, is that following the period of responding to COVID and the cyber attack, we also have significant reforms coming up in the adult social care space. So the lifetime cap on care costs is being brought in, and the fair cost of care is being introduced. And we do not yet have a sustainable funding settlement for adult social care. So we are looking at more pressures both on our workforce and our providers in the next year or so, and we are not as yet entirely clear what those requirements will be, or also how they will be funded. So there will be funding attached to it, but whether that funding will be sufficient to meet those costs is something that we are working very closely to try and model at the moment. So I'm conscious of time. I might leave that there and leave it open to questions.
Great, thanks for that. I mean, I think this issue about a collapsing market and us needing to respond in terms of set up provision ourselves is absolutely at the core of this at a time when we have less and less resources, when the price of providing a service is going up, is again, as in the children's service, is going to be one of our dilemmas for the next few years. Colleagues, questions to Helen, issues you want to raise in this whole key issue?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm just looking at the COVID, the uptake of COVID-19 vaccination rates is quite high on the register there. I'm just wondering, you know, if we could just speak to that a little bit as to what, you know, we see how that's going to pan out going forward.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the uptake of vaccination rates, members might know, in the social care workforce was mandated briefly, or we talked about it being mandated. So it was mandated for workers in care homes. And then there was a consultation on bringing that in for workers in the wider social care sector, which was ultimately not taken forward. That being said, the rates in Hackney of vaccination in both our vulnerable adult social care users in care settings and our care staff are actually quite good. And that's been due to a huge amount of work by both the public health team and the adult social care commissioning team. Where we're more concerned is that since the mandatory vaccination was withdrawn, people are less inclined to have boosters. And you'll be aware that, you know, immunity wanes over time, and the effect of the vaccine wanes over time. We're also not particularly high in terms of rates of vaccination in the wider population. So people who might be in vulnerable age groups, but who are not necessarily in receipt of adult social care, have not necessarily taken up the vaccine to the degree that we would like, which does leave them vulnerable for greater chance of hospital admission should they catch COVID. So there's a huge amount of work ongoing, both with our health partners and public health, specifically targeting mainly through GPs, but also through some of our voluntary sector partners, particular communities who are vaccine hesitant, and that is ongoing, as is the offer of vaccination. So it's what's known as an evergreen offer, and any member of the social care or health workforce who wishes to take up the vaccine at any point is prioritised to do so, as are our vulnerable residents.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Lynch.
Thanks, Chair. It was just to say as well that when we talk about safeguard, and I think we all need to be aware that this does include adults as well.
Absolutely.
And I think I picked, sorry, it's my bugbear. I picked up again, one of your biggest risks is around your people, around your most precious asset, which is your staff. And again, around the challenges that I'm sure you're very reflective of all sort of social work areas at the moment, of retaining staff, recruiting and retaining them. And I just wondered what could be done at a more sort of higher level within the organisation around this, because obviously, you know, as I keep saying, this is a statutory duty of the council, and if there's one workforce that we need to be worried about, it's this workforce. And what we can do as members to support this with you as well. I can see that we talked around, you've been extremely honest around the fact that you have a high reliance on agency staff as well, and what support is needed from a sort of wider strategic workforce opportunity to sort of look at how we can potentially look at potential redeployment into this, or what other ways we can do that. As you may know, I come from an NHS workforce background, and obviously we are quite also have these challenges as well around looking at different roles and what can be done potentially by other forms of workforce that may be different to what's traditionally done in terms of mitigating that risk, obviously not wanting to dilute the workforce, but are we looking at different ways of delivering care and different roles and what have you, which I'm sure you are doing, but just to have that assurance.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, workforce is one of our key priorities, and we've created the role this year of an assistant director in my directorate for workforce and quality. So we have a very specific focus on workforce, partly because it is not just our council employed workforce that I'm worried about. I'm particularly worried, and it is a national issue, about recruiting frontline care workers, both for care homes and for home care. And some of that, I think, is, as you've rightly mentioned, about developing career pathways, so that we can offer proper apprenticeships and proper career opportunities that span across the NHS and social care. And, for example, offer training opportunities for people to become occupational therapists. We have several areas of shortage, and actually some of those careers, I think, are quite sorry, I've lost my word, would be quite attractive to some of our young people in Hackney. So how we develop career pathways and apprenticeships to attract local people in Hackney into those types of opportunities is one of our key priorities. So as part of that, what we've been doing this year is co-designing with both our partners and our staff a skills academy, which has very set pathways and opportunities that people can take up and can progress through. And this is both to attract and retain. So some of those opportunities are about qualifications. So for example, this year, our social work apprenticeship scheme, we have attracted 3 candidates, all of whom have come from our frontline caring roles, to train them to become social workers. And we are ramping that up so that we can offer the occupational therapy qualification as soon as that comes online. And we already have 10 applications for that from our housing with care staff, our frontline schemes.
Great, thanks, Helen. Nothing from Councillor Gordon? Okay, well, thanks very much, Helen, for that. I mean, I do think both these reports are really concerning, in the sense that so much of our services are under enormous pressure and expectation, and yet the resources are clearly inadequate to fund them. And I just see this as a rising crisis because there are an awful lot of these risks that are near red in both education and young people and adults. And I commend both of you for the initiatives that are being taken to try and mitigate that. But underneath it, there is this inexorable pressure that I think it drives us dangerously close to failure, which I think is going to be one of the challenges of the next administration, frankly. With that sobering thing, thanks again, Jackie and Helen, for that, and look forward to future reports. Right, let's move on then to the internal audit plan for 22-23. Michael.
Thank you, Chair. The committee is asked to consider and also approve the internal audit plan for the year ahead. The report that you have sets out the plan that we have for audit work for 22-23, following 2 difficult years for all services, which has inevitably impacted on the assurance work that we've been able to carry out during that time. The really positive note for me is that there's been very strong engagement from all of the service areas that audit have spoken to in drawing up the plan, which does give grounds for optimism for the year ahead that we will return to a more typical level of performance and have more audit work to base assurance on in a year's time. The plan is derived from a number of sources. So importantly, there's those conversations with service owners about the risks and the issues that they're facing. There's the risk assessment work that feeds into it. There are a number of audits that couldn't be delivered over the previous year that have been rolled forwards. There's looking at areas in the council where there's change. There's obviously more of that than there ever used to be. Governance issues raised through the last AGS. Follow-up work from previous audits, and also a consideration of the materiality of the council systems. So we take all that together, which results in the audit plan that is set out on pages 136 to 139 of the report that you have. You'll see from that that it does include some of the areas that the committee has been particularly interested in over the previous year. So, for example, the repairs backlog, the progress against the net zero targets, and several audits around the ICT environment, including a needs assessment of ICT, are all included in the plan. The final point I draw out in the summary is that the plan is designed to be flexible. With the level of change that we experience, it's highly likely that some audits will drop out and there will be a need for emerging issues to be picked up through the year as part of the audit plan. So there is flexibility within it to allow us to flex and to shift as we need to there. So that's a brief overview of the plan, and I'll pause and take any questions.
Great, thanks very much. I mean, I must say, just reading through it seemed a reasonable balance of departmental, and particularly where we face risk in these areas. Any comments? No. Yep, I think you have members' approval for that, Michael. It looks a reasonable plan.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on then to the update. Up to March 22, it's the quarterly update, yeah?
So the most significant current issue for audit continues to be the fallout from the cyber attack, which means that legitimately it has been difficult to audit many areas that were in the previous audit plan over the course of the last 12 months. You will see at section 4.4 of the report that 22 audits were deferred from that plan, and 20 of those, the reason for that was the cyber attack. So it really is the key fundamental issue that we face at the moment. That is a sizable number of audits. The remainder of the plan, 93% of it is in progress. All the audits have been delivered. This is the second full year when a smaller number of audit reviews have been possible. using that base of the smaller number combined with assurance from previous years when a higher range of assurance work was possible, I am pleased to say that we are of the opinion that the overall system of internal control is providing adequate level of assurance for Hackney. As noted on the previous item, there is a ground for optimism for the year ahead because we have got engagement from people and we have got support from the service areas. So I do have a degree of confidence for the year ahead. The percentage of limited and no assurance reports is comfortably within the previous year levels, but we do need to remember that the inability to carry out an audit is a level of concern of itself. And I'd also note that the implementation of recommendations remains at a high level and within the service key performance indicators. Switching to the investigation side of things, the trends continue as they were reported to the previous meeting, in that there are higher volumes of referrals and outcomes from both the tenancy fraud work and the blue badge parking work. The numbers are lower than previous for the no recourse to public funds investigations. There is an element there of a time lag between not just the investigation, but also the work of the NRPF team to assess cases and that actually being reflected on systems. And it remains to be seen if the levels of applications for that service will rebound over time. The quantifiable benefits from investigations work remain on an upward trend. And at that point, I'll pause again and take any questions.
Great, thanks, Michael. I mean, the broad conclusion I draw is that we are pretty certain that despite all the pressures the last couple of years on internal audit, moving people around, not carrying out surveys, your feel is that a level of compliance remains high throughout the organisation. Is that a correct interpretation? One area that because obviously it could be that we're missing it because we're not being able to devote as much resource. One area I did raise a question because in the whole business grants field, there has been quite a lot of evidence that there has been widespread fraud. We're not picking it up in our area, and it'd be interesting to know why we have a uniquely compliant business grants applicants, or is that to misread the situation?
Taking the business grants item first, I think that Hackney has been particularly good at doing prepayment assurance as well as post-payment checks. I don't think that was universally the case in all other authorities. So we were putting the extra resource in before the money went out the door without unduly delaying that process. So I think that has been a factor. It's certainly the case that we did pick up fraudulent applications, but we identified those before we'd made the payment, which is the success story. In terms of the assurance level, yes, the audit work that has been carried out does provide that ground for assurance. The caveat I would give is that that's on the basis of work that could go ahead. So just a note of caution, if an audit hasn't been possible, that is a concern of itself, and it could be that where the audit work can't take place, that's actually where the problem is. If the system is not available, if the information is not available, then we're talking about the unknown. So I would put that caveat on it, but you're right in terms of what we have been able to achieve. Yes, the assurance levels have held up.
Well, I take pleasure from that, but Hackney's regime of business grants was a model that the rest of government should have followed, which is to do some proper pre-checks, is the lesson I draw from that. So, excellent. Colleagues, any points on this? Yes, Councillor Smythe.
Thank you, Chair. It's more just trying to understand, because you talk about the number of days that goes towards each particular element of the plan. I'm looking at page 138. You've got fire safety risks there, 15 days. I'm just trying to understand. I mean, are we talking about all of our properties? We're going to do a fire risk assessment on over 15 days. That's what I'm trying to understand. Just to, if you could just help me understand what's going on there. Thanks.
Certainly, I can see where the confusion comes from. That's absolutely not what this is saying. The fire risk assessment work is the responsibility of the housing service. The way the audit work would take place is we would look at the procedures that they're following, what they're doing to give the assurance that the fire safety work is on track, being carried out to time. So we would be looking at the processes and the policies, the outcomes from their work, that there's clear guidance for people as to what they should be doing. We wouldn't be going in and looking at an individual property to see that the work had been carried out. That's a technical level of expertise.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. Appreciate that. And then we move on to the whistleblower policy. Ian, are you going to report on this, or is Michael?
Chair, if you're happy, I would take items 12 and 13 together. Item 12 is the annual report on whistleblowing activity. Item 13 is the refreshed whistleblower policy. They're very similar, neither are particularly long. The only distinction would be that the policy is asking for your approval of the changes to it. So the whistleblowing progress report is an annual report that comes to committee, and effectively it's saying that whistleblowing continues to be a small but important source of work that is referred to the investigation team to follow up on. There are two distinctions within that whistleblowing. There are whistleblowers that come through an independent hotline that is available to staff and other council workers, that they can phone and report concerns that they do not feel comfortable to raise directly with management or with audit, and their anonymity is protected. The rights of a whistleblower are protected under law, the public concern at work, and if someone were to choose not to come via the whistleblowing hotline but to report directly to a council officer, they would still have the same protections available to them. So we distinguish in the report. The levels through both routes of whistleblowing activity are low, but it's important because it provides a mechanism for people to raise concerns without feeling that they need to take, in the first instance, a matter outside the council, and we have a chance to look at it ourselves first. The levels are roughly in line with what's been reported in previous years. Moving on to the whistleblowing policy, the report includes its minor updates. The real reason for this is because the points of contact across Hackney have changed. So that was the most important reason for this. That's all up to date. There are linkages included to other relevant Hackney policies, and there's also change procedures set out at the back of the document, and all the changes are highlighted in the document. So for both items, that's the update and the basis of the request for the approval of the policy. And if there's any questions, happy to take those.
Great, I think they all seem very sensible, tidying up the issues. So I think I'm seeing support all around for the report. So thanks very much, Michael. Appreciate that. And approve those changes. Excellent. We're in final lap. Next item is the annual report, which has already been gone to the council because of the whole timetable issue. But I think it's just worth saying in the, without going through in any detail, that what it does record is the recommendation to follow up on and build on the initiatives that have been taken particularly around performance reporting, oversight of the budget that we've now instituted as a regular issue, and we talked about earlier. The oversight of and issues around cyber and the external audit. I think we need to follow all those initiatives up over the next period. And the challenge that we've talked about a number of times, which is the way that the departmental risk has obviously been the core of how we've dealt with things, but the climate change issue highlights that actually all departments need to be involved, and we need to review the risk, the way we assess risk in terms of accountability and reporting. I think is something that again the next administration will need to build on. So that's those recommendations in the report. I hope that the future chair and committee will take on board. So unless there are any additions to that, let's take the, well, first of all, are people happy with the annual report that's already been given? And we can move on to what I thought was a very good report and review on the net zero session that we had. And Deirdre I think, is still on, loyally supporting to the end. First of all, so thank you for organising and preparing the report. I thought both went off very well, and I'm pleased with results. So I'll come to my conclusions at the end. But if you want to sort of summarise your the main points, Deirdre, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I was just going to do a very brief overview. I mean, obviously we've done the deep dive review. We had that one session in March. The review was to provide Audit Committee with assurance around internal governance arrangements, the development of how the CAP
Come back, Deirdre. No. No, she's not coming back. Can we then, I'd just like to summarise, because I thought members did raise some very important issues at the end of well, after the officers had given, I thought very, you're back.
I'm back. Sorry, I'm sorry. My internet is it's been fine up until I started speaking. I really do apologise. Okay, so there's a copy to the slide deck. I think the report sets out the discussions that we had and the more detailed work that took place in between the discussions and the production of report. It covered the development of the thematic action plans and how that is being linked to the delivery of the targets. So we're going to consider not just what we're going to do, but the impact of what we're going to do. Management arrangements, the management arrangements were found to be robust, but I'll leave that to the chair to set out his conclusions. One of the key things that members of this committee did pick up was the importance of consultation and engagement with the wider community to get that trust and buy-in to what we are doing. And obviously there's a big section on financing and resources. It's a significant financial challenge. It was noted we're not starting from scratch. We've got a £25 million capital programme delivering on initiatives in this area. The chair's conclusions are set out at section 7, and there are 4 recommendations flowing from those conclusions relating to the importance of robust performance monitoring on the delivery against the CAP once it's approved, the importance of engagement of all council departments in this agenda, the development of that community and engagement strategy needs to be developed further to secure that trust and buy-in. And the committee endorsed Ian's commitment to that longer term capital planning, which will help with the funding strategy for the CAP development work. Hope that covers it as quickly as I could.
You're perfect. Thanks, Deirdre. Just to underline the 4 points, because I think they emerged very usefully from our discussion and contribution of members to that. The need particularly to build in the thematic action plans, which there was a lot of good work on input, less clear so far in terms of what you might call a sort of financial model, which would tell you £1 invested in this activity will have this impact on carbon. And I think that's going to be a necessary step if we can allocate what are going to be very scarce and difficult resources. The second issue, I think, as you rightly point to, with the management arrangements, we were reassured, I think, that there was a lot of good work that you and colleagues are leading in terms of pulling the initiatives together. I think all of us were concerned that the other departments need to play a much fuller role in this process. And as a result of that, there needs to be, the executive will need to take a stronger oversight role in terms of ensuring that there is that cooperation across the whole council. And I thought actually the way that housing services have begun to address the dilemmas and depth of the problem is a good example of where other departments need to go. And I think the issue that I can say, but officers obviously can't, is the executive member in charge of the net zero target must have sufficient authority in order to ensure that joint work carries on. The point you've made about community, I thought that was a very powerful point that a number of members made during that, which is there's reference to it, but no development of how that should work. And I think all members were saying that should be a more significant part of the climate action plan, and more detail put in how the community can both support and understand, get to grips with the issue. Without it, this will just become an internal exercise. And finally, the point you've made briefly about financing, this gap that I think badly needs to be addressed for credibility of any 2030 initiatives, any 2030 targets, that there is a route to funding. There won't be necessarily detailed plans at this stage, but certainly a credible route to the funds that will be necessary. And I know, Ian, you're working on that, but I think that'll be absolutely vital. Without it, we'll just be preparing documents, and the Greta Thunberg of what are you doing charge, I think, will be rightly heard. So those 4 initiatives I would propose from this, which I thought, as I say, was very good, a good session, powerful contributions from officers, good discussion. We ought to pass those on both to Chief Executive and Mayor in the future administration. Colleagues, over to you.
I don't want to labour the point about retrofits again too much, but I was just skimming through the document there just to see if there was any discussion about, because they've chosen EPC level C, I think, for in general to aim for. That's Energy Performance Certificate level C, and it goes from A to G, so A being really good, G being really bad. I think that the approach needs to be kind of more nuanced, and I just wanted to see a little bit more detail in the report about retrofit in general, because I think it's a really important, essential topic, especially if we're considering spending £600 million on it. I've talked about insulation and other things. I've done a lot of research into this, and basically I think we need to be drilling down to each individual property, each individual block as to what it actually needs. I think a kind of cross the board sort of philosophy is maybe not the absolute way to go. I think it needs to be slightly more nuanced, and I'd just like to sort of drill down a bit more into what we're talking about when we talk about retrofit, because it needs a lot of experience essentially there in that particular area.
Deirdre, you wanted to...
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we're housing services in conjunction with the project management team for CAP are in the process of developing a pilot scheme that represents a typography of over 50% of the housing stock. And whilst we talk about EPCC, no decision has been made as to what level we are actually going to go to at that, whether it's EPC B or C. A is going to be a tall order for the housing stock we have, but that's not to say we're not going to aim for that. The pilot will inform where we're going to go to. So this pilot work is to inform and iron out all those issues. So the decision on where we take, what EPC standard we're going to has yet to be made. The 600 million is based on the approximate cost of getting the whole housing stock to EPCC, but no decisions have been made yet because we don't really know. It's a very broad estimate.
Quickly.
Very quickly, the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy have just released a document talking about what criteria we should be using for retrofits. I sent a copy of that document to Matthew Carrington recently. I hope he received it the other evening, but it's just more for information. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yep, acknowledged. Yeah, Margaret.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I'm very, very pleased that this report's been done. I mean, I think this is obviously going to be one of the huge challenges for the new administration. And no, I agree with the the 4 areas that have been identified, but I don't think we can. I don't think anyone's underestimating the actual amount of detailed work that needs to be done to unpick those challenges. I mean, across the council, and also the sort of increasingly the increasing challenges that are going to be making it even more difficult. I mean, the extent of the climate emergency, I think, has been revealed to us as a council and the community over the last 4 years. Although obviously colleagues like Councillor Smith have been warning us about this for years. So, but I mean, also the sort of other challenges that we've been uncovering this evening really are all things that are going to make realising our ambitions even more difficult. So I think it's it's very, very important that it's kept within the near focus, I think, of corporate risk and this committee and obviously across the whole organisation. So that's more of a speech than a question, but it's
Points well made. Deirdre, if you want to add any final points?
I think the key point is in terms of that question of the investment versus impact on the target that will emerge from the development of the high level strategic actions and the projects that sit under those actions, and therefore we will get an understanding of we will get a prioritisation on where to invest the money to get the greatest impact, and that's what we're working to, so that when the draft cap comes to Cabinet for approval to go to consult, there'll be a greater understanding of those actions that will have the greatest impact on reducing our carbon emissions.
Great, thanks very much. Well, I think a solid endorsement for the work and for the conclusions. I would like this, as I say, this report to be passed formally to the Chief Exec and to the incoming Mayor to make sure that they are in front of them as a conclusion to this work. So if people are happy with that, let's ensure that's done. Peter, if you could record that. Very good. And we're nearing the last point, the Audit Committee work programme, which I think is fairly standard. I don't think there's any just usual things. So I take it, unless anyone's got any comments, we can approve that. And finally, we have to. Oh yeah. Formally, we need to now go into private session. I don't think there's anyone who's not a Hackney employee or member who's on the call. Is that right?
I think it's very just needs to go stream.
Yeah.